Hi, my name is Beth and I'm the sewing pattern designer and blogger at Sew DIY. Today's video is part 5 of our Bucket Tote Sew Along, and today we're going to be finishing our totes. I released this pattern a few weeks ago and it comes with both a regular and a small size tote. This tote features handles that are made from cotton webbing with large exterior pockets in the middle. And the bottom is an oval shape with rounded corners at the ends and pleats so that the bag is smaller on the bottom and wider at the top. I designed it this way so that it's really easy to throw everything in your tote, and then when you need to grab something, it's really easy to find. Last week we sewed the body together and attached our handles, and today we're going to be attaching the bottom of the bag to the body and then attaching the lining to the exterior. I'll show you 2 different ways to attach the lining to the exterior. For the regular size, I'm going to show you the method that I use in the instruction booklet. In that method, the lining and the exterior are sewn right sides together and then turned right side out through an opening in the lining. During the testing of the pattern, some testers suggested an alternate method that they preferred. And I think this method works especially well if you have a thicker fabric that is harder to handle and harder to turn right side out. I will be demonstrating that alternate method with the small size bag. And if you want to skip ahead to different sections, there are timestamps in the show notes. If you don't have your own copy of the pattern yet, I also have a link to the pattern in the show notes. Let's get started. Here I'm working with the regular size bag, and I have the straps all sewn on and the body is all sewn together, and I'm ready to sew it to the bottom. So this can really be the trickiest step to sew around these curved edges, but I have a few tips for you. So what's hard about sewing a curve is that the cut edge of the curved piece is bigger than the cut edge of the straight piece. And that is just mathematics, that our seam line is inside the cut edge. So that is smaller than the outside. When you pin this together, you want to align your notches. So along the straight edges of the bottom and along the center pocketed part of the bag, you have double notches, and you'll want to align those. And then there are single notches at the rounded end and where the pleat is. So this center of the pleat will align with this rounded end. So you just want to go around and pin or clip everything together. So when I pin, I like to start with the notches, pin the straight parts, and then pin the curved edges. So another thing that you can do to kind of help your fabric fit together is make little clips into the bag. So just with your scissors, you would make just a tiny clip, and you want to make sure you don't go more than a 1/2 inch. So you might even want to draw in your seam line or stitch a line of basting along the seam line. The clips will help spread out that seam allowance so that it can match the curve of the bottom of the bag. Try not to do it too much. Be very careful. You will want to clip after sewing, but you can do it before sewing if you need extra help. Here it is with everything clipped together, and I just wanted to show you, I drew in the stitching line at the seam allowance, and then you don't need to clip very far. You don't need to clip all the way to the line, but just clipping that bag a little bit will help you spread it out and flatten it so that you can stitch a flat seam line. For this seam, I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and a straight stitch. When stitching, I recommend having the bottom piece on the bottom and the body of the bag on top. I also recommend basting the curved edges first. If you're not familiar, basting is just a long straight stitch that's easy to remove if you need to adjust the fabric. Finally, you may find it helpful to hold the weight of the bag in your left hand while you use the right hand to guide the fabric under the needle. This bag can get heavy, and without support, gravity may pull it away from the needle while you're stitching. So here I have the bag basted, and what you want to do after basting is just take a look Check and make sure that you don't have any wrinkles, that your seam allowances are still aligned, and undo the stitching anywhere that it doesn't look good. You can also turn the bag right side out and check that you don't see any wrinkles from the outside. Then go ahead and stitch along this seam line, and it's going to be a little bit easier to handle without any pins or clips getting in your way. So here I have my lining and my lining bottom, and I want to now stitch these together. So this is a little bit different from the exterior because the lining is just one piece, but the notches are very similar to the exterior. So we have 2 notches for the center of the body, and that will be the middle of the pocket, and the seam line. Those will go against this flat edge or straight edge of the bottom, and then the ends of the pleats, that very middle of the pleat, will line up with the single notch on the rounded edge. So you want to pin this together just like the exterior. When you stitch, you want to leave an opening, and probably like 3.5 inches wide. So start along one straight edge, go all the way around, and then stop. And then we'll turn the bag right side out through that opening. To stitch the lining to the bottom, I'm using a straight stitch with a regular length and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just like the exterior, I recommend basting the curved edges first. Then go back and stitch with a regular length stitch after ensuring that there are no wrinkles in the fabric. Don't forget to leave an opening if you are using method 1 to attach the lining. If you are sewing method 2, you don't need to leave an opening. Here I have the lining stitched to the bottom of the bag, and I have the opening on one straight side, and I need to trim or grade the seam allowances and clip into the curves. I tend to like to press my seam allowances towards the bottom, so I'm going to trim that seam allowance a little bit shorter. And I trim everywhere except for where the opening is because I want to have a good amount of seam allowance to use when I close that hole up. So the purpose of grading the seam allowances to different lengths is just so that we reduce the bulk and we don't have any hard edges or lumps. So I'm just taking like 1/8 of an inch off the body seam allowance. And then I want to cut out some little wedges around the curve. So you can actually go and do it right where you clipped before if you want. I tend to fold and pinch and then cut a little triangle like you do when you're making snowflakes. And with all of this trimming, just be careful not to cut through your seam line. So you want to do this all the way around, then give it a gentle press, and also do this for the exterior of the bag. I have the bottom of the bag all graded and clipped, and I'm ready to press it. So because we are pressing curves, it might be helpful to have a tailor's hand, and this is just kind of like a hard pillow, and you can use it instead of the ironing board. So I'm going to put it inside my bag, and then it is a little bit tricky, but I'm just going to press my seams towards the bottom of the bag. And I do this for both the lining and the exterior. So you can even turn it up on the end of that tailor's ham and press it. So the ham gives you kind of a nice 3D curve to work with. And then also do the same thing for the exterior of the bag. And for this one, you might want to also turn it right side out and look at it from the right side. And push that seam allowance towards the bottom. And then press it. Now that I have these pieces pressed and trimmed. I'm ready to sew them together. So we're going to sew them right sides together and then turn it right side out through the opening in the lining. So I'm going to put the exterior inside the lining with right sides together. And you want to move these handles out of the way, just fold them down towards the bottom. So you want to get the exterior bag inside. Again, make sure you have right sides together. Match up the notches. There are single notches on the ends and double notches in the center. And then clip or pin these edges together. Then we can stitch all the way around the top. Okay, I am going to be stitching this seam using a straight stitch at a regular length. My seam allowance is 1/2 inch. While you sew, it will probably help if you hold up the bag with your left hand and then guide the fabric with your right hand. Yeah, so holding up the bag with your left hand will prevent the gravity from pulling that bag away from the presser foot. Okay, here is the bag all stitched. You'll want to go and make sure that none of the seam allowances have gotten folded over, and then you can grade the seam allowance. And I don't do a lot of grading here. I would just cut the lining down to about half the width of the seam allowance and go all the way around like this. Now we're ready to turn the bag right side out. So you'll just stick your hand inside the hole in the lining and then gently pull the exterior to the other side, out through this opening. All right, so you'll have something like this, and now we push the lining inside the exterior. It really looks like a bag now, and our next step is to press this a little bit more. When I press this, I not only want to get it flat, but I want to get the fabric folded along that seam line as closely as possible, and preferably with the lining just a tiny bit inside. I definitely don't want the lining peeking out to the right side, so I can also try to cheat it towards the wrong side. One way to kind of position the fabric that I like to do is just kind of push and roll along the seam line with my fingers before I press it. One thing I want to try to avoid is the fabric folding like this, where the seam line is down below the fold. I want to get that fold as close to the seam line as possible. Okay, now I'm going to top stitch this top edge. I'm using a straight stitch with a 2.8 length, and I've moved my needle to the right, and I'll be stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge. I like to start and stop behind where one of the straps is. As you stitch, make sure that you don't sew over the straps. We're only sewing through the fabric. And if you need to, you can use your left hand to hold the bag. So you'll want to stitch right back over where you started, and you can do a back stitch if you like. And then for a cleaner look, you can also pull the threads to the wrong side and tie them off there. Finally, we need to close the opening in the lining. So I have just pinned along where this opening is, and I'm going to stitch very close to that edge. This will be visible, but it's just on the inside. So here's where I closed up that opening in the lining. It does create a little ridge, but I don't really mind it because it's inside. So if you want this seam to be invisible, you can stitch it by hand. The final step is removing the basting from these pleats, and you can just use a seam ripper and then pull out or trim any threads. You want to remove the markings and again trim any other threads that are around. Yeah, and it's also a good idea to just give the bag one final press. Now let's do method 2 for attaching the lining to the exterior. This is called a drop-in method because we're not pulling the bag through an opening in the lining. We're just going to stick the lining right inside and then top stitch. This is good if you have particularly thick fabric. Personally, I don't like it as much because I think you have to be really, really accurate with your pressing. And I think it's harder to be accurate with pressing than it is to be accurate with stitching. So that's why I prefer to stitch this top seam. But this is a great option, and I know some people prefer this way of constructing the bag. So I have gone ahead and attached the bottoms to the lining and exterior. The only difference from how I did it in method 1 is that I did not leave an opening in the lining. This is fully stitched together. I have also pressed down this top edge, and for the exterior, I pressed it down 1/2 inch. And for the interior lining, I pressed it down 5/8 of an inch. You can stick your lining inside before pressing and decide how deep you want it. The way the pattern is drafted, this lining is 1/8 of an inch shorter than the exterior. So you may or may not need to press this down more than 1/2 inch. Now, because we can't grade the seams after stitching, you will want to grade the seam before you stitch it together. So I have pressed this 5/8 of an inch, and I just want to trim it down about half so it's a little shorter than the exterior. And I'll go all the way around. Then you want to get some pins or clips, put the lining right inside, and you want to get it really pushed down in there. And you can use your fingers to push the bottoms together and to push the seam allowances the direction you want them to go. And then you want to line up the center point. So you may not be able to see the pattern markings anymore because we've pressed these edges down, but you can use this seam and kind of fold the bag in half and mark the center points to get it all aligned. And I would try to get these folded edges aligned exactly, or have that lining just be slightly lower than the exterior. You'll want to be very exact. Maybe you'll want to even use an adhesive. I'm going to finish pinning and clipping this together and then take it to the machine. Okay, now I'm going to stitch this top edge, and I am stitching through only the fabric and not the straps. I'm going to start and stop stitching behind where one of the straps is just to hide that overlapping stitching. I'm using a straight stitch with a 2.8 length, and I've moved my needle over to the right. So I'm stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the top folded edge. I recommend stitching very slowly for this seam because you're top stitching and essentially sewing the seam at the same time, and the only thing holding the fabric together is the pins. And you know, I'm always a little bit nervous when I'm top stitching. I want to make sure I don't mess it up. So just take this step slow. When you get back to where you started, you can do a few stitches over the top of your first stitches, and you can do a little back stitch if you want to. For an extra clean look, you can also pull the threads to the wrong side and tie them off in a knot. Here's the final bag, all finished. The only thing to do at the end is remove the basting stitches from the pleats and give it a final press. I hope that you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and if you haven't already, I would be so honored if you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be notified of future videos. I have a few more planned where I'm going to be doing some hacks of the bag, including handles made from fabric and a recessed zipper. And if you don't have your own copy of the pattern yet, make sure to check out the show notes. Happy sewing!